So let us now move on to study inflation a bit. Inflation is a very important topic in finance for multiple reasons. You can imagine, for example, if you are a household and you are deciding about how much to save and how much to consume today, you have to take into account that prices of the goods may be changing in the future. And in particular, it may be higher compared to today, right? So you would need to factor that in when you are deciding, okay, this is the amount of money I want to save, or this is what I want my investments to give up in the future, right? From the government finance perspective, inflation is also again very important because you have a lot of components such as the government employees' salaries as well as future retirement pensions that you give that are indexed to inflation, right? So if inflation goes up, for instance, future government expenditure would also go up, and you need to take that into account while you are deciding about have to have different budget allocations for the future as well, right? So we are going to structure our discussion of inflation in two parts. So in the first part, we are going to think about, generally speaking, what do we mean by inflation and how is it measured? And in the second part, we'll go into more details about how does inflation factor in terms of the discussion that we have had so far in terms of value and capital budgeting, right? So for instance, we would like to see how does inflation tie into the cost of borrowing, and how does inflation factor in when we are thinking about doing NPV analysis, right? So these are some things that we are interested in. So first, what do we mean by inflation? Well, intuitively speaking, if you ask people around, inflation is basically the increase in the price of goods, right? And one consequence of the price of goods going up is that with inflation, the general price level in the economy is rising and money loses its value, right? So two important points. It has to be that, it's that the average price level in the economy is rising, right? It's not just about increase in price of one or two goods, right? Secondly, what do we mean by money losing its value? So, for example, I recall that when I was young, I came across a very famous grammar textbook, which was also the standard textbook during my time in school. But it was, interestingly enough, also the textbook, the standard choice textbook during my relatives' time in school as well, which was one generation back, right? And I was very surprised to see that the price of the book which was listed on my relative's book was around rupees 15, whereas during my time in school, the price of that book had become 250, right? So it's not just about kind of like, one particular book, what 100 rupees of money could have purchased during my relative's time, one generation back. It was different from what 100 rupees was able to purchase at the time when I was school, right? So over time, basically because of increase in prices, the value of money erodes, right? So that's the idea. Now, if inflation is 10% and is equal across all goods, then we would have had that good which costs 100 today will end up costing 110 units right next year, right? Because inflation is the increase in the prices, right? Now, typically the complication comes in from the fact that inflation does not affect all goods equally, right? So you have got different goods, some of which price increases much more compared to the other goods, and you might also have some goods whose price actually decreases, right? So in that case, we need to actually think a bit more systematically about how should we go about actually measuring inflation, okay? And that's the next topic that we are looking at. Okay, so suppose that we are interested in studying how much the cost of living has increased over time. So one of the most common measures of actually measuring that is what is known as the Consumer Price Index, and this is often abbreviated as CPI. So what does the CPI do? So the CPI measures the overall cost of goods and services bought by a typical household. Okay, and the interpretation is that when the CPI rises, the household has to spend more money to maintain their standard of living, and we are going to think of this maintaining the standard of living as being able to purchase this typical basket of goods that we are thinking of. Okay, so how do we go about constructing the CPI? So the first step is to survey households to determine the composition of the typical household's basket of goods and services. And this typical basket of goods and services typically differs across different regions, or it might differ across rural and urban areas, as we'll see. Okay, so first, we have to figure out that under the region under consideration, what is the typical basket of goods and services of a household in that region. Okay. The next step is to collect data on consumer prices. Okay. And this is data that we have to collect both for the base year, okay, the original year in which we had fixed the basket of goods, as well as the current year, whose kind of like price change we are considering compared to the base year, right? And we have to do this for all the items that are in the basket, okay? So once we have done that, we can figure out what was the cost of purchasing that basket in the base year, which is the original year, remember, as well as what is the cost of purchasing that basket in the current year. Okay, once we have those two quantities, then CPI is calculated as the ratio of the cost of basket in the current year divided by the cost of basket in the base year multiplied by 100. Okay, so this is the definition of CPI. Okay, so let me also give you a useful shortcut often that is used to calculate CPI. And let's just generalize things a bit. Okay, so imagine that you have an economy with n goods, and we have got the price of good I at time t as P superscript I subscript T. Okay, so the subscript refers to the time, and this time, for instance, can be either the past period, which we are calling the base period, or it can be the current period. So T equal to B would be the base period, and T equal to C would be the current period. And I here refers to the good I that we are considering, right? So this I can be any one of these n goods. When we say it's superscript I, we don't mean P to the power I. We just are kind of like referring that this is the price of the ith good. Okay. Similarly, just as we are defined P superscript I subscript T as the price of good I at time T, we can accordingly define Q superscript I subscript T as the quantity of good I at time T. Okay. All right. So now let's recall what we did in the construction of the CPI. So the first step is to actually fix the basket of goods. Okay. So you have got this n goods. You kind of decide that you want to have, let's say, 10 units of good 1, 20 units of good 2, and so on. Okay. And this is decided in the base period. Okay. So what do we now have to calculate? So if we go back and look at this, first we need to calculate what's the cost of buying that basket in the base year. So the quantity is fixed from the base year's perspective. So we have got that for the ith good, this is the amount of the ith good that we want to have in the basket. So let's call that QBI. Okay. And we need to then, to calculate the cost of that basket in the base year, we need to multiply this quantity by the price of that good in the base year. Okay. But this is just for good I, right? So we have to do the same thing for good 1, good 2, good 3, good 4, good n, and we'll add them up to get the total cost across the n goods, right? So this is step the denominator. Now in the numerator, we have that the cost of basket in the current year. Now the quantity of the goods that we want to buy, that is fixed in terms of the basket that we had, and so therefore in the numerator you still have the quantities as QBI, right? This is the same good that we had decided on the base year. Okay, but the price is now not given by PBI, but it's given by PCI. Right? So this is the price of the ith good at time period C, which is the current period, right? So we are going to multiply that by QPI, okay? And we are going to do this for all the n goods, and then we are going to add up these things. So that gives us the numerator as the cost of the basket in the current year. And finally, we need to multiply this by 100. Okay, so this is in terms of symbols, this is what CPI is. So let us actually play around with this expression and get an alternative formula for calculating the CPI. So let's divide throughout by 100 so that we have CPI by 100 equal to summation over I PCI times QBI divided by summation over I PBI QBI, right? This is just following from this step by dividing throughout by 100. Okay. Let's now break up the summation that we have in the numerator. Okay. So what does that mean? So we have here, we are summing over from I from 1 to n. So let's just write that in terms of the n goods. So we have got, for instance, this will be PC1 QB1 plus PC2 QB2 plus PC3 QB3 and so on, right? So we are just breaking up the numerator. We can always do that. A plus B by X is A by X plus B by X, right? That's the formula, for example, we are using. Okay, so we have this expression here as a result of breaking up the summation in the numerator. Now, let's do the following operation. I want to divide this first fraction that you see by an expression equal to PB1 divided by PC1. Okay. So why would I want to do that? Actually, let's take a step back. What I want to do first is divide and multiply by PB1 divided by PB1. Okay. Now, what is the result of doing that? You would say, okay, PB1 divided by PB1 is just 1. Why are we doing it? Well, then if we do that, the interesting thing is that actually kind of like you can rearrange this. So you have in the numerator now PC1, QB1 multiplied by PV1. Okay. And you can bring the PB1 to the left hand side and PC1 to the right hand side. Okay. So this is what you get as a result of rearranging that. And why is this useful? Because now if you think about it, you have got PB1 by multiplied by QB1 divided by summation over I, PBI, QBI. Now, what is this telling us? So the numerator PB1 multiplied by QB1 is telling us what is the total expenditure on good 1 in the base period. The denominator is telling us what is the total expenditure across all goods in the base period, right? So this ratio PB1 multiplied by QB1 divided by summation over I, PBI, QBI is basically telling us what's the fraction of the money in the base year that we had spent on good B, good 1, right? Okay. What are we multiplying it by? The ratio of the price of good 1 in the current period divided by the price in the base period. Okay. And we can do the same expression for second good as well, right? So we have, remember, PC2, QB2. What we want to do is multiply throughout by this part by PB2 divided by PB2, so which again is equal to 1. You do the same thing as you did here. So you again have PB2, QB2, okay? And in the denominator, you have this PB2. So again, this expression that you see, PB2, QB2 divided by summation over I, PBI, QBI is just basically the share of the expenditure on good 2, right? And so on, right? So as a result of this expression, what we have done is that we have managed to express the CPI, okay, in terms of the weighted average of the change in a price for each of the goods, okay? And the weights are basically given by the relative importance of each good in the base year GDP. So we'll talk about what GDP is, but think about it as total expenditure for now, okay? So that's another way of kind of like thinking about the CPI, okay? So make sure that you can kind of like understand this, go through the expressions, and if required, kind of like put in n equal to 3 and see how this looks like, okay? This will also give you a bit more practice with working with summations. Okay, so remember, I told you that the CPI relies on this typical basket, and this typical basket may be different for urban areas and rural areas. So for instance, in India, this is what the weightages across different categories look like for urban areas and rural areas in 2012, right? So in urban area, food and beverage had a weightage component of 36.29%. Clothing and footwear had 5.57%, housing had 21.67%, fuel and light had 5.58%, and so on. And in the rural area, food and beverage had 54.18%, clothing and footwear had 7.36%, fuel and light had 7.94%, and you had these other products, right? So you can see that the main difference is that housing had a big share in urban area, whereas the food and beverage was much larger in the rural area. And this kind of reflects some of the consumption patterns that you see across different areas. And hence, it is important to actually have this variation in context if we are going to actually accurately reflect what are the different costs of living in the different areas, right? Okay. So CPI is an accurate measure of the cost of the selected goods that make up the typical basket, but it may not necessarily exactly measure the cost of maintaining a given standard of life. Remember that we had motivated this by saying that we were looking at CPI because we want to think about what does it cost to maintain a standard of life. And we operationalized it by thinking about fix a typical basket and then track how much does it cost to purchase that basket across different points in time, right? So why may not these two things be the same? Well, if you think about it, imagine that one of the prices of the goods that is there in the typical basket is going up, right? So imagine that you have the price of, let's say, papayas are going up, right? Now, typically, if it were you and the price of papaya only is kind of like going up, then what you might do is you might want to substitute out from papaya and maybe start eating another fruit, right? But this would not be accounted for in the CPI, because in the CPI, the cost of the basket of goods remains the same, right? And we are looking at the cost of that basket. So the fact that consumers actually may choose to respond to changes in prices by substituting what they typically consume, right? That is not actually necessarily accounted for in the CPI, right? So then this would lead to basically a distortion in thinking in terms of what is the cost of maintaining a given standard of living. Secondly, you might have that there might be over time introduction of new goods coming in, right? So what was considered a typical basket may not necessarily be the typical basket across different time periods. So for instance, mobile phones are an important perhaps component, and also the phone bills that you pay, the mobile phone bills that you pay, but that might not have been kind of like a important thing to track, let's say 20 years ago, right? So you do have this introduction of new goods, and you need to then think about how do you account for that in the CPI so that it accurately reflects what is the real cost of maintaining this, right? Okay. You might also have got unmeasured quality changes, right? So think about kind of like television becoming better over time. So the same amount of money that you were spending on television before and now, perhaps that money purchases you somewhat better quality, right? And same thing for computers and so on. So some of these things can be measured, but a lot of these things cannot be measured. So if I just have, for instance, price of, let's say, one TV as the in the basket, right? Now, what that one TV is, that can also actually have a lot of different things, right? So it can be the quality of TV has improved over time, and that is also something has led to basically a better standard of living, right? But that would not be accounted for if you just say, okay, I'm just looking at one TV over time, right? So that's another thing to think about when we think whether CPI accurately measures the cost of maintaining the given standard of life. Okay, so people have also come up with other measures of calculating inflation. So, for instance, something that is based on directly on GDP is actually commonly used as well. So, we use the term GDP before, and this is a term that you cannot avoid if you are thinking about, let's say, economics, macroeconomics, and finance. So, what is GDP? So, GDP is basically a measure of production or income generated in a particular region or economy in a given period of time. So formally, it's the market value of final goods and services produced in the economy during a given period, right? So there are each of these words have important significance. So market value means that, for instance, if you are producing something in home for your own consumption, that would not necessarily be accounted for in the GDP. The word final in the final goods and services means that somehow we need to figure out a way of not counting the intermediate goods as well as the final goods, because that would lead to a problem of overcounting. It is something which is produced in the economy, not necessarily just consumed in the economy, right? So basically that means that you have to kind of think about how to incorporate exports and imports when you are kind of doing this calculation. And finally, GDP refers to something that is happening during a given period, right? So when we say GDP of, let's say, a particular state for some time, we have to mention what that time is, right? Are we talking about quarterly GDP, or are we talking about annual GDP, and so on, right? So all of these things are something that to be thinking about, and these are details that you might encounter if you take a course in economics. So let us ignore that for now. Let's think about the implications for the inflation rate. So how should we think about market value? So market value is basically measured as the product of prices and quantities, right? Why do we do that? Because if we were just kind of thinking of adding up different quantities, it would make it very hard to compare across different quantities, right? So we need somehow to convert all the quantities into a common unit, and GDP does that by converting it into monetary units by multiplying it by the price of those goods, right? So let's see how that works. So imagine that you have an economy which produced 50 chocolates and 20 shoes last year. Okay. And imagine that the price of a chocolate and a shoe last year were 100 per unit and 250 per unit, respectively. Okay. So we have actually two terms that we associate with GDP. which are known as nominal GDP and real GDP. So let's make sure that we understand what that means. So nominal GDP in a particular year is the value of GDP in that year using the prices in that year, right? So the nominal GDP last year, for instance, would be calculated as following. So you need to look at the sum of the market value, right, of the chocolates and the shoes. So what was the market value of chocolates? So there were 50 chocolates. We need to multiply it by the price per unit of each chocolate. So multiply that by 100. So you end up getting 5,000 units. Okay. So units in terms of money, right? So if it was in terms of rupees, you would have like 5,000 rupees. And you also need to take into account the shoes. So you had 20 shoes at a cost of 250 per unit. So that is again 5,000 units. So once you add up, you end up getting that the nominal GDP last year was 5,000 plus 5,000 equal to 10,000. Okay. So that's how you calculate nominal GDP. Now, let's consider this year. Imagine that this year again, the production remains the same as last year. So therefore, you have a production of 50 chocolates and 20 shoes again. But the price of a chocolate and shoe this year have changed. Okay. So remember last year it was 100 per unit for chocolate and 250 per unit for shoe. So let's assume that the prices have doubled, so that the price of a chocolate this year is 200 per unit and price of a shoe this year is 500. Okay. So how do we calculate the nominal GDP this year? So remember, this is GDP. So therefore, the sum of market values at the current prices. So this will now become 50 into 200. So 10,000 for the chocolates, and again 20 into 500. So again 10,000 more for the shoes. So therefore, nominal GDP is 20,000, right? So basically, we see that in this case, GDP has doubled, right? In particular, nominal GDP has doubled, even though the output remains unchanged, right? So this is interesting because remember, one of the motivation of the GDP was thinking in terms of measuring production across different time points, right? Or comparing it across different countries. But here we can see that even though production has remained the same, which is 50 chocolates and 20 shoes across these 2 years, the data would still kind of suggest that nominal GDP has doubled, and this is because the prices has doubled, right? Okay, so lesson is that nominal GDP can change due to changes in quantities or prices. You could have done the analysis by changing the quantity of chocolates also changing at the same time, and you would have had that this was changing, right? So oftentimes, because we want to think of GDP as a measure of production, one often also uses something called the real GDP, right? So what is the real GDP? Real GDP measures the value of production using constant prices, right? Note the difference. In the nominal GDP case, you are measuring the value of GDP using current prices. So what that means is that nominal GDP in year T would involve calculating the GDP using the prices in period T. However, when you're calculating real GDP, what you do is you fix a base period, okay? You look at what is the price in that period, and you use those same prices to actually calculate the value of production across different years, right? So for example, if you're thinking of what is the real GDP in current year, but you use the last year's prices as base. So remember the last year's prices were 100 for chocolate and 250 for a shoe. You end up getting that, well, the real GDP is actually 5,000 plus 5,000 and 10,000, right? So what you observe is that the real GDP is 10,000 and it was also 10,000 last year. And so therefore it has not changed, right? And this is not surprising, right? Why is it not surprising? Because, well, production has not changed. And that is exactly what we were wanting to capture, right? Real GDP to see what is the changes in production, right? So what we end up, therefore, is that basically the production does not change. Therefore, the real GDP will not change, right? But now, suppose let's do a different exercise. Suppose that instead production this year was 100 chocolates and 40 shoes. So if you now compare with this, you can see that it's exactly double of what the production was last year, right? So remember, last year production was 50 chocolates and 20 shoes. This year, it's actually 100 chocolates and 40 shoes. And so now, therefore, if you calculate the real GDP, you will end up getting 100 into 100, right? Because you've got 100 chocolates at a price of 100 each. Remember, we are using last year's prices as base. And you have got 40 into 250. So that ends up into 20,000, right? So basically, the changes in the real GDP are coming in only due to changes in quantities, right? Okay, so now that we understand that changes in nominal GDP can be due to prices or quantities, whereas changes in real GDPs are only due to changes in quantities, we can actually use these two measures to come up with a way of calculating what is the changes in prices, right? So this is how the kind of like the figure looks like for India. The sky blue actually represents the GDP in constant prices, so that's the real GDP, and the dark blue figure at the bottom is the nominal GDP, which is the prices at the current thing. And this is, for instance, taken from World Development Indicator. Okay, and you can kind of like look at different time points. Okay. All right. So how do we kind of like use all of this to actually calculate inflation? Well, the measure of inflation that is calculated using the nominal GDP and the real GDP is known as the GDP deflator, right? And the idea is, as I mentioned before, very simple. The increase in nominal GDP can come from either an increase in the quantity, which remember is captured by basically changes in the real GDP, or it can come in from a change in the prices, right? So therefore, if the nominal GDP is rising faster than the real GDP, then it must mean that the difference is coming from an increase in prices, right? So therefore, now to formalize this idea, so the GDP deflator in a particular year, okay, is defined as the ratio of the nominal GDP to the real GDP for that year. So let's call the GDP deflator as PT. So this is think about it as the price level in year T. So that's going to be given by nominal GDP in year T divided by the real GDP in year T. Okay. So now what do we mean by inflation and inflation rate? So inflation is basically nothing but sustained rise in the general level of prices, okay, which is the price level, right? So this is the price level that we talked about. So if this level is going up over time, this is what we think of as inflation. And the inflation rate is the rate at which the price level is increasing, right? So we need to look at, for example, what's the percentage growth of the price level that will give us the inflation rate. Now, one important thing to keep in mind is that just as kind of like CPI had some issues, GDP deflator also has some issues, right? So let's think about what those are. So the GDP deflator is telling you what's the average price of output, okay? That is the final goods produced in the economy, right? However, this is actually different from what the consumers actually care about, right? So consumers care about what's the average price of consumption, right? They don't necessarily care about what's the average price of output that is produced in the economy, right? Why are these two things not the same? Because you have got some goods in the GDP that are sold not to consumers, but to people abroad. So think about the exports of the country. So if the price of the exports are going up, then it need not necessarily add to the increase in the cost of living of the citizens of a particular country, right? Or the domestic residents of a particular country. And the second thing is that, what the GDP deflator or what an inflation rate measured on the basis of GDP deflator would not capture is that if you have got prices of goods that people are importing from abroad going up, right? So for example, if you have got prices of food, which is imported from abroad, or prices of fuel, which is imported from abroad going up, that would not necessarily be captured in the GDP deflator, right? So these are two important things to keep in mind. Okay, so there are also some other measures that are often used. So one such measure is what is known as the Wholesale Price Index, or WPI, right? So this is based on prices that are paid to wholesalers by other producers. So this is more in terms of thinking whether prices are going up at a kind of like a production level. And this has like three broad components. So the one component is primary articles. So think about that as like agricultural items that are used in production, or mineral items that are used in production. You have a fuel and power component, and you also have a manufactured products component. So these have different weights in terms of calculating this wholesale price index, and these weights may change over time. So in the recent past, these were some numbers just to give you an idea. So primary articles had a weightage of around 23%. Fuel and power had a weightage of around 13%, and manufactured products had a weightage of around 64%. But again, as I mentioned, these numbers might change, so you might want to refer to whatever is the latest number, okay? And finally, you might often hear or come across another term known as core inflation, right? So these are some things, again, that, if you hear about RBI's announcement about different things, this is something that is often comes up. So this is, again, another measure that is used to think about measuring inflation. And basically, it is intended to think about the long run trend in prices, right? And it often excludes some volatile categories such as food and fuel, right? However, of course, in case of India, this actually, you can well imagine that if you kind of like are focusing on core inflation, this would actually lead to an elimination of a significant proportion of the commodity basket, right? So recall the weights that we had thought about when we had looked at the CPI thing. We can see that typically these two elements, food and fuel, are often very important components of the consumption pattern of individuals. So if you are not ignoring those, which is what if you're ignoring these items, which is what we do when you're looking at core inflation, then that might not necessarily accurately reflect what is the cost of living for a typical person in the economy.